Most people think this question is harmless. It sounds professional, expected, even. But the moment someone asks you to define your weaknesses, you need to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, because this isn't just a question, it's a diagnostic tool. When you answer, you're not just sharing information, you're revealing patterns. You're showing how you see yourself, how you handle pressure, where you struggle, and how aware you are of your own behavior. And for someone who knows how to listen properly, that answer becomes a map, not of your strengths, of your pressure points. Now, here's where most people make the mistake. They think honesty equals safety. So they give a clean, well-structured answer and something that sounds reflective, something that shows growth. But even then, the content matters less than the signal, because every weakness you name creates an entry point. If you say you struggle with confidence, that tells someone exactly where hesitation can be introduced. If you say you overthink, that signals where doubt can be amplified. If you say you're too trusting, that highlights where boundaries can be tested. This isn't about manipulation in an obvious sense. It's about awareness. The more someone understands your internal patterns, the less effort they need to influence your external behavior. And it doesn't happen immediately. At first, nothing changes. The conversation moves on. Everything feels normal. But later, in moments that matter, that information gets referenced, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. A comment placed at the right time, a tone shift when you're already uncertain, a subtle push in the direction you already admitted is difficult for you. And suddenly, your own words start working against you. Now, here's the deeper layer. This question also measures how you handle exposure. Do you rush to fill the silence? Do you try to impress with self-awareness? Do you reveal more than necessary just to appear honest? Because the way you answer often reveals more than the answer itself. Controlled individuals don't avoid the question. They manage it. They give just enough to satisfy the surface, but not enough to create leverage. They understand that transparency without boundaries is not strength, it's access, and access in the wrong hands becomes control. So the next time you're asked about your weaknesses, don't think of it as a moment to confess. Think of it as a moment to calibrate, because once you define your own limits out loud, you're not the only one who knows where they are anymore. And the moment someone else can see your weak points clearly, they don't need to search for them. Most people hear this question and assume it's about context. It sounds reasonable, almost necessary. If someone wants to understand your past, they need to know what happened, right? But that's not what's really being measured. When someone asks why your last relationship or job failed, they're not just collecting facts. They're analyzing your narrative. They're watching how you assign responsibility, how you process conflict, and how you position yourself inside a negative outcome. Because your answer doesn't just describe the past, it predicts your future behavior. Now here's where it gets precise. If you place all the blame externally, you signal avoidance. You show that when things go wrong, you disconnect yourself from the outcome. That tells the observer one thing: accountability is limited. If you place all the blame on yourself, you signal vulnerability. You show that you absorb responsibility even beyond what's accurate. That tells the observer something else. Pressure can be applied, and you're likely to carry it. And if you try to balance both sides, carefully explaining every detail, you reveal something different. How much you need to be understood. Every version of this answer creates a profile. And once that profile is formed, it becomes a filter. Everything you say after that gets interpreted through it, not because it's accurate, but because it's consistent. This is how perception locks in. Now consider the second layer. This question often appears early, before trust is established. Before there's any real reason to disclose something personal or complex. That timing matters. Because revealing detailed information about past conflict to someone who hasn't earned access doesn't build connection. It accelerates judgment. They're not there when it happened. They don't have the full context. All they have is your version and the way you deliver it. Tone, emotion, emphasis, pauses, all of it gets analyzed. And small details carry weight. If your tone shifts when you mention a specific moment, that becomes a signal. If you hesitate before assigning responsibility, that becomes data. If you sound emotionally charged, even slightly, that becomes part of the profile. This isn't about what happened anymore. It's about how you present it. And once again, your own words start defining how you're perceived moving forward. Now, here's the critical part most people miss. You don't need to give a complete answer to be understood. In fact, the more you explain, the more variables you introduce, and the more opportunities there are for misinterpretation. Controlled responses aren't about hiding. They're about structuring. You acknowledge the outcome without exposing every detail. You show awareness without overexposing emotion. You take responsibility where it's real, but you don't turn your past into an open file for analysis, because once your past is fully exposed to someone who is still forming their opinion of you, you don't control how that information is used anymore. And when your past becomes the lens through which you're evaluated, it doesn't stay in the past. It starts shaping your present. So the next time someone asks why something ended, don't rush to explain every detail, because the more you say, the more they have to define you with. And once that definition is set, it's not easy to change. Fear is not just an emotion, it's a signal. And when you say it out loud, it becomes a coordinate. Most people answer this question casually. They think it's about personality, about being open, about showing depth. So they name something real: rejection, failure, being alone, losing control. On the surface, it sounds like self-awareness, but underneath it's something else. It's exposure, because fear identifies where your system destabilizes. It shows what disrupts your decision-making, what shifts your behavior under pressure, what makes you hesitate, overcorrect, or comply. And once that's known, influence becomes easier, not through force, but through precision. Now, here's where it becomes subtle. No one needs to use your fear directly. They just need to move near it. If your fear is rejection, all it takes is the suggestion of distance. A slight withdrawal, a change in tone. Suddenly, your focus shifts. You start adjusting to avoid that outcome. Not because someone told you to, but because your system is trying to protect itself. If your fear is failure, pressure becomes the tool. Expectations increase, deadlines tighten, the environment becomes more demanding, and without realizing it, you start making decisions to avoid the feeling, not to achieve the result. This is how control operates without being visible, because once your fear is defined, your behavior becomes predictable in certain conditions. Not always, but enough to be useful. And predictability is leverage. Now consider the second layer. When you reveal your fear, you're also revealing how you process risk. Do you avoid it? Do you confront it? Do you rationalize it? The way you describe your fear shows how you deal with uncertainty, and that tells someone how far they can push before you react. This is why the delivery matters as much as the content. If you speak about your fear with hesitation, it signals sensitivity. If you over-explain it, it signals importance. If you try to minimize it, it signals discomfort. Every variation gives information about how deeply that fear affects you. And once that depth is understood, it doesn't get forgotten. It gets stored, because people who pay attention don't need to act immediately. They wait. They observe when the right moment appears, a moment where your fear aligns with a decision point. And that's when influence becomes efficient. A small suggestion, a subtle shift, a well-timed comment, and suddenly you're not choosing freely. You're choosing to avoid what you already identified as a threat. Now, here's what most people miss. You don't need to announce your fear to prove strength. Strength is shown in how you manage it, not how you describe it. Because once it's externalized to the wrong person, it stops being just yours. It becomes accessible. So the next time someone asks what you fear most, don't treat it like a moment of openness. Treat it like a moment of positioning, because the moment your deepest trigger is clearly defined, it doesn't take much for someone to build a situation around it. Most people think sharing a secret builds connection. It feels personal, exclusive, like you're creating a bond that didn't exist before. But what actually gets created is something else: imbalance. Because the moment you reveal something private, the dynamic shifts. One person now holds information the other doesn't. And that difference matters more than people realize. It starts subtly. A question framed as curiosity. Tell me something no one else knows about you. It sounds harmless, even inviting. So you search for something meaningful, something that proves trust, something that feels real. And when you say it out loud, it feels like you've strengthened the connection. But what you've actually done is transfer control, because a secret isn't just information, it's leverage. Not always used, not always intentional, but always present. The person who knows more about you has more influence over how the interaction evolves, especially in moments of tension. Now, here's where it becomes precise. The value of a secret isn't just in what it is. It's in when it can be used, not necessarily exposed. That's obvious and rare. The real influence is subtle. It shows up in timing, in how someone responds to you after they know something personal, a shift in tone, a slightly different level of confidence, a change in how they position themselves in the conversation. Because once someone knows something sensitive about you, they no longer interact with you as an unknown. They interact with you as a variable they understand better than you understand them. And that creates advantage. Now consider the second layer. When you share a secret, you're also revealing your threshold for trust. How quickly you open up, how much you're willing to disclose without requiring proof of safety. And that tells someone how fast they can gain access, not just to information, but to influence. If you reveal something deep too early, it signals that emotional access can be accelerated, that boundaries are flexible under the right conditions. And once that's identified, the interaction changes. You may still feel in control, but the structure has already shifted, because now there's asymmetry. They know something about you that could affect how you're seen, how you're judged, or how you respond under pressure. and you don't have the same level of insight into them, this isn't about assuming bad intent. It's about understanding dynamics. Information changes positioning, and once information leaves your control, so does your ability to manage how it's used. Even if it's never spoken about again, it exists in the background of every interaction. It influences perception, even silently. Now, here's the part most people overlook. You don't need to prove trust by offering something personal. Real trust builds over time through consistency, through aligned behavior, not through sudden exposure. Because the moment you trade privacy for connection too early, you're not building something stable. You're creating a situation where one side has more to lose. So the next time someone asks you to share a secret, don't rush to fill the silence with something meaningful, because once something private becomes known, it doesn't return to being private, and the balance you had before doesn't return with it. Most people answer this question immediately. Of course you can. It feels natural, polite, like the right thing to say in the moment. But that response reveals more than it resolves, because trust doesn't work like that. It isn't something you grant on command, and it isn't something someone can confirm with a single question. Trust is built through patterns, repeated behavior over time that proves consistency, reliability, and intent. So when someone asks, "Can I trust you?" they're not actually verifying trust. They're observing how you respond under pressure. Now look at the structure of the question. It puts you in a position where any direct answer can be used to define you. If you say yes without hesitation, you signal compliance. You show that you're willing to provide reassurance instantly without requiring evidence. That can be interpreted as eagerness to please or a lack of boundaries around commitment. If you hesitate even slightly, it signals caution, and that caution gets interpreted as uncertainty, or worse, as something to be suspicious of. Now you're in a position where you have to explain yourself, even though the question itself wasn't grounded in anything measurable. And if you try to give a balanced answer, something thoughtful, something nuanced, you reveal something else. How much you care about being perceived correctly, every version becomes data. But here's the deeper layer. This question shifts responsibility. It places the burden of trust on your words instead of on observable behavior. It suggests that trust can be confirmed through a statement rather than earned through consistency. And once you accept that frame, you're playing by rules that don't actually define trust. Because real trust doesn't need to be announced. It shows up in small, repeated actions, following through on what you say, being consistent across different situations, responding the same way when it's easy and when it's not. That's what builds trust, not a verbal agreement in a single moment. Now consider timing. This question often appears early, before there's enough interaction to justify it. That's intentional. It forces you to make a commitment before there's any real foundation. And once that commitment is spoken, it can be referenced later. You said I could trust you. Now your words are being used as a standard, even if the context has changed. Even if the expectation was never clearly defined, you're now accountable to a statement, not a process. And that's where control enters, because once your reliability is tied to a declaration instead of behavior, it becomes easier to challenge, question, or manipulate. Any perceived inconsistency can be framed as a violation, not of actual trust, but of the promise you made under pressure. Now, here's what most people miss. You don't need to answer this question directly to demonstrate trustworthiness. In fact, the more grounded response is to avoid turning trust into a claim at all. You let behavior speak. You allow time to define the dynamic, because trust that depends on words can be broken by words, but trust built on patterns is harder to disrupt. So the next time someone asks if they can trust you, don't rush to give them certainty in a sentence, because the moment you reduce trust to an answer, you've already stepped away from how it's actually built. Most people think this question is an invitation, to be honest. It sounds direct, even respectful. What do you really think about me? It feels like a chance to clear the air, to be real, to say what's on your mind without filters. But the structure of the question puts you in a controlled position, because no matter how you answer, you're stepping into a frame where your words will define the dynamic moving forward. Not improve it, define it. If you respond positively, emphasizing their strengths, you risk sounding calculated, too polished, too agreeable, and that creates doubt. They don't just hear what you said, they analyze why you said it that way. Now, your sincerity is being evaluated instead of accepted. If you respond critically, even with good intent, you introduce tension. Because most people don't ask this question to receive unfiltered feedback. They ask it to confirm a perception. And when your answer doesn't match that expectation, it creates friction. Not necessarily visible, but present. And if you try to balance both a mix of positive and constructive, you reveal something else. How carefully you're managing their reaction. How much you're trying to control the outcome of the conversation. Every version gives them data. Now here's where it becomes precise. This question forces you to expose your internal evaluation of them without knowing how that information will be used. It's a one-sided reveal. They gain clarity on how you see them, but you don't gain the same level of insight in return. That creates asymmetry because once someone knows exactly how you perceive them, they can adjust their behavior accordingly. If they know you see them as confident, they maintain that image. If they know you see them as unpredictable, they can use that perception to their advantage. Your words become a reference point they can work with, and you don't control how they apply it. Now consider the timing again. This question often appears when the dynamic is still forming. When roles aren't fully defined, that's not accidental. It allows them to position themselves relative to your perception early before anything is stable. And your answer becomes the foundation. But here's the critical part most people overlook. Your perception of someone is not fixed. It changes with context, with time, with behavior. The moment you define it out loud, you freeze it into a statement. And once it's spoken, it can be held against future interactions. You said, you think I'm like this. Now your past words are being used to measure your current responses, and any deviation becomes something that needs to be explained. This is how simple questions create long-term constraints, because once you commit to a defined opinion, you're no longer just observing the person, you're maintaining consistency with what you said about them, and that limits flexibility. Now, here's what grounded awareness looks like. You don't rush to give a full evaluation. You don't reduce a complex perception into a single statement under pressure. You keep your observations fluid, adaptable, and based on ongoing behavior, not locked into a fixed description. Because the moment you define someone completely in one conversation, you're not just revealing what you think. You're giving them a framework to operate within. And once that framework is in their hands, you don't control how they use it anymore.